Alright, let's jump right into it. And in the 1940s and 50s, they had some brassieres that had these unusual shapes to them. And just looking at that from the perspective of, does that mean they could have used this one aspect to better conceal their transgenders amongst the regular population? Yes, they could have. You can completely lessen the concern of whether you have believable implants, and people will notice that there's something off. If you can get regular women to wear something like this, that changes the shape of the chest rather drastically. This is what they do. They not only try and make the transgenders look the same as regular people, they also deceive the regular population into cooperating with fashion fads that will kind of lessen the divide between the regular people and the transgendered ones. And you can see that with this. Now also in the 1940s, this is something extremely important to be aware of, is these sort of like a corset idea, where it compresses the entire body to have a completely different look from the original. This, looks like a typical sort of young mother to me, a 30-year-old mother, something like that. There's nothing terribly wrong with her, right? You can see the female spinal arch depicted in this image, and in this image, you can see that they've lessened that, similar to in the 1920s. They were promoting this body line that is much more like what the transgenders looked like. The MTFs have straight back because males have straight backs. So if you wear something like this that compresses all the female body fat and kind of changes the posture of a person in order to try and make them look more like a transgender, you've got to be aware of that. When we do our transvestigations, we have to know that in this time period they were wearing things like this under their clothing. So I doubt that you could have completely changed the shape quite this much. This looks like an illustration, not an actual photograph, but it is very important to be aware of the fact that they're wearing these kinds of things under the clothes. So again, this is just the same as in the 1920s, making women loathe their female figures, telling them that they're revolting, basically, and encouraging them to desire a board-like male figure. Difference between the 20s and the 40s is you've at least got something feminine at the front. But again, because of the strange brassieres they often wore as well, the shape wasn't quite right. So this is an appearance that the MTFs could easily exhibit, and in fact they did. And that's why they were trying to encourage regular women to wear this kind of compressing article of clothing underneath their outerwear in order to bring them closer to the same standard as the MTFs. So this does look like real photography, unlike the last one, so you can see that it really does change the shape of a person. Now, I do still doubt that the spinal shape could be quite as flat as in the first one if it's on a real woman, because, women, if you try to tilt your pelvis forward and get a completely straight back, it just doesn't happen. There's too much of an arch, you can't fake that look properly. You can tell that someone's doing that kind of pose when they do it. That being said, the spinal arch does vary in intensity between different individuals, and on some girls their back does look almost completely straight. This is very rare, and in such a case it's still possible to tell the back is female, and especially during pregnancy that back will exhibit the spinal arch because of the increased weight on the front of the body that will pull the spine down into that arched shape to distribute the weight over the length of the spine. On such a woman with a straighter spine, you would have the best results with this kind of undergarment, but I do doubt that they could completely obliterate the appearance of the spinal arch on the average woman who does have one with this kind of undergarment. But you can see that it really does compress in the body and give it a natural looking shape, so again, this is important to be aware of. Now, just like in the 30s, weight gain to be more attractive advertisements. Also worthy of note is the objectification of females. It's beginning to be all about sex appeal in this time period. A couple of decades before this, they wouldn't have said something like this at all. They wouldn't have dared say something this vulgar in the mainstream media. But what this is saying to females is they're a product. And it causes the objectification of women not just by men, but also by women themselves. It's funny that women don't realize most of the time when they have bad self-esteem, it's because they are objectifying themselves and considering their body as some kind of product that is inadequate If we evaluated people based on personality and on the way we have relationships with each other and, interact with each other and treat each other, people's actual virtues and assets, rather than just their outward appearance, then so many of the obsessions with appearance and bad self-esteem would just fade away. Women who objectified themselves and kind of viewed themselves in terms of how attractive they are to the opposite gender as how they evaluate their self-worth. So this was beginning to instill in females the attitude of the most important virtue they can have is sex appeal, and it's teaching men that it's okay to think this way, when in reality neither of our genders should be thinking that way. So making the body into a product that's never good enough. Gee, that sure seems like the recipe for a healthy population, not? Saying it wasn't good to be skinny and lonely, paired with how would I look in a bathing suit if you were overweight? So they have this mixed messaging coming out in all their advertising, that you don't want to be overweight and you don't want to be too skinny. So basically that would have addressed every woman out there, because women are always going to think that there is something wrong with them if someone suggests there could be something wrong with them. So, that's a great way for corporations to have cashed in on it, and basically it was encouraging everyone to not believe any shape was acceptable except for the shape that they were promoting with their figure-altering underwear and their MTF transgenders. Don't be fat. Don't be skinny. Don't be anything. Stop being female. That will solve it. And again, a lazy way to reduce. Always has to be lazy, just like in modern advertising. The human mindset is still just the same as back then. And here you can really see this is the figure they were promoting. And, with their compressing underwear underneath, they would have been able to achieve it to an extent, but this does look like the kind of an MTF promotion with showing really wide shoulders and really narrow hips. And they were encouraging women to want this look, so you can really see that this, in the 40s, they'd begun pushing that kind of subtly, providing a way to change the actual female's figure to look like that with the undergarments, which, we don't have anymore. Girls will just kind of look at the famous MTFs and wonder why they don't look like that. We no longer have underwear that changes the female body to look like that, but they had to start it that way. They had to let women think it was possible to look this way, while the MTFs just look that way naturally because, obviously these are male dimensions. Wide shoulders, narrow hips, it's male. As for the hair in the 1940s, as I've mentioned before, the short hair was really a drastic change from all the previous centuries where women would have had long hair. Now in the 40s they did give it a very feminine look. So again, they weren't trying to shove these new fashions at people without still appealing to the traditional mindset of, females being feminine. So they still had feminine styles to this hair in this time period, but they were changing the standard that had existed for centuries, so people would no longer look at short hair and think, oh, male, because they'd changed the ideas about that. The males still had the hairstyle pretty much the same as it had been for a long time. It seems they begun to do the work on females first. The MTFs were the big project first of all, and in modern years we're seeing more FTMs, but they just didn't seem to have the capability to make convincing FTMs many decades ago. Every FTM I've seen from those time periods, you can really tell that they look very ungainly, very strange. They just don't look natural. So it makes sense to me that they would have begun the agenda with the gender they were more easily able to transgender, which in the 1940s with the shoulder pads in all of the suits is another way that they hid their transgenders amongst the regular females. Because a typical female, not all females, but a typical female has more of a slope to the shoulders, a skeletal slope. So, here the line would probably come down around like that. And so they filled in this space with the shoulder pads so that the transgenders with their square male shoulders, not all males have square shoulders, but most do. It's quite typical. They did this so that they would be able to kind of blend which one was real and which one wasn't. They do this with fashions. The hemline is up again, And as I mentioned in the previous video in the 1920s, this means they were removing hair, which the hormone treatments were not as sophisticated back in this time period as they are now. So I do wonder just how much they would have affected the hair growth of the individuals who were taking them. And personally, I don't think they would have been as effective as they are now. Now for the MTFs, they probably don't really get a lot of male hair growth because they have hormone blockers when they're young. Possibly some of them are castrated, I don't really know the details, but they are given a lot of female hormones. They're well synthesized and the doses are carefully measured and so forth. But in this time period, they didn't have a sophisticated medical knowledge, so I really think that the males probably would have had still some more hair growth than you would expect on a female. So this hair removal was very necessary in the 1920s when they began to show these people with the advent of the mainstream media, and up to now in the 40s where we're looking at. If they hadn't been removing hair and the MTFs didn't have female growth, well, that would have been a bit obvious to people, wouldn't it? So it was necessary to create this artificial standard to say, oh, if the hair is removed on the legs, it's female, and if it's there, it's male. They created that artificial standard, even though females naturally have a lot less body hair than men, and if we didn't do this, if we didn't remove hair, we'd be able to easily tell which ones were male and which ones were female through observation of the thickness and quality of growth. But this is what they've done, and it was to create an artificial standard. High heels also got a little bit higher during this time period, and I've mentioned before that high heels will first of all change the posture of a person. They kind of tilt the pelvis a little bit, so that can make MTF's stance and gait a little more convincing to people. And also, the front portion of the foot that touches the ground will appear smaller to people, so it's more believable as a female foot when you see a foot in high heels, even if it's a male foot. As well as the shoulder pads in suits, they also had these puffed sleeves, which again did the same sort of thing in extending the shoulders, so it would make the width of the shoulders appear wider than the hips. I've seen people who've looked at photos from someone from this time period and they say, look at those wide shoulders, but they're completely ignoring the fact that there's a whole bunch of air in here, there's just empty space. So it's important to be aware of these fashion trends when we look at individuals, and also to remember that this body line may not be indicative of the person's actual body line underneath there. And in the 1940s, they really began to embrace the trousers. In the 20s and 30s, it was more the shocking women who wore it, but it began to be popular and acceptable during the 40s and into the 50s to wear trousers for women. And again, this is just like the short hair phenomenon. It's altering a standard that we had for centuries, for millennia actually. Women did not wear trousers. So it was again altering perceptions and saying anyone can wear this, anyone can do their hair this way. And that, the essential purpose of that was to break down our mental barriers against which gender can do what, and when we see someone, we automatically take these things into account. And, for centuries we'd see trousers and think male. So that would have been very interesting psychologically to have all these people with this kind of mental programming and having it changed, so it no longer would have existed quite the same way. And again, those body-altering undergarments changed the body line, as well as wearing these kind of tight belts that a lot of times women would wear, and they'd wear it cinched a bit lower than it should be actually for the female waist. So a lot of the fashion was very deceptive in this time period. Now, while it was deceptive, you still could easily tell if someone's female or male if you know what to look for. Or you just need to look for the skeletal markers, the female Q angle, the wide hips, the curve to the spine. But essentially, they were beginning to push things, having females wear clothes that were not as feminine as they used to be, and have hairstyles that were short, so they were not as feminine as they used to be. The male clothes were, pretty similar to some of the female outfits. So again, that's changing our perceptions on gender. Now, in the 40s in particular, and also in the decades preceding and ensuing, we had men wearing their trousers up very high. This is just about above where the female waist indentation would be on a female, and that would be about here. And what it did, these trousers would make it look as though the men had wider hips, because they're very baggy and worn up very high. So it changes the male body line. You can see from these fashion sketches how much that kind of creates an hourglass figure on natural males. So fashion isn't just to conceal the transgenders, but to try and make the regular people look more like them. If you have all the men wearing these kinds of trousers that make it look like they've got these wide hips and little female waists, then the FTMs do stand out less. So, I mean, it's difficult to get a real idea about the body of a person when they wear things like this to alter the body line. It's still possible, but, you know, when I show things like this, I want to caution people to be careful and to carefully look at multiple shots and from different angles if they can find them, rather than just assume that the person must be female because its hips look wider when these trousers were specifically designed to create that look. Now, in the 1950s, the makeup, just like in the 40s, had dialed things back since the 30s and especially the 20s. It was milder, more feminine, and at this point the women started to sort of have their own eyebrows again too. In the 40s they did as well, so that false standard was done away with. The hair was essentially the same as in the 40s, a little bit longer in a lot of cases. And another fad was an inflatable brassiere, which means an obsession with a large bosom began in this time period. In the modern world, we're so conditioned to think that it's normal to be obsessed with a large bosom that we might not question it. But actually it wasn't an obsession for many, many centuries, and it began only a few decades ago that it became a cultural, widespread obsession to have a thin body and a large bosom, which, you know, most women don't actually have. If a woman's very thin, typically she won't have a really large bosom. It takes a woman to actually be curvy and have a fat distribution all over her body, or else it won't go there as well. And in most cases, you know, there's different genetic cases out there, but most of the time a woman who's bone thin will not have much up there. So that's another way that they taught people to believe that their sort of MTFs are superior to a natural woman, is because they'll have a bone thin MTF, it's kind of a lean male look, and then, you know, stick things on the front of it, and or, you know, use an inflatable device like in this time period. The hair of the males in the 1950s, you know, sometimes you had this kind of pompadour look, and then also just more mild hair as well, but it still essentially hadn't diverged from the sort of traditional male look of being short that had been around for centuries. Still clean shaven. Since the Victorian era, we've had clean shaven men, most of all, for a few decades. And here, again in the 50s, stop looking like this, stop being skinny, start looking like this. It's amusing to me because this is definitely the way that most women would want to look these days compared to this one. Now, entering into the 60s, they're hacking on this, get the skinny figures filled out, but it has to be scientifically, and you have to do it without padding or without exercising or overeating. Now, going strictly into the 60s, this hairstyle would have been quite useful in disguising transgenders. It's so distracting because there's so much of it that people will kind of look at the whole picture and ignore the facial features, if there are any masculine features, as well as the fact that typically males will have larger skulls than females. Males at the same height as a female will have a slightly larger skull. So if you do this and kind of alter the size of the skull so drastically to begin with, so that every female's head looks enormous, it's an effective way of disguising the transgenders in with the regular females. So obviously not every woman back then had hair like this, but it was the fashion to try and get big hair. Again, the makeup's there. As I've mentioned before, makeup is an artificial means by which we now determine gender. People are programmed so that automatically if they see this kind of look, this kind of makeup on a face, they're going to say, oh, it's female. Doesn't matter what the features are, doesn't matter if it's got a large jaw, a wide dental arch, wide-spaced, wide eyes. You know, they don't look at the actual bone structure, the facial features of these people anymore. They just look at the makeup. And makeup equals female to the average person these days. And again, that began in the 20s. And it was their way to disguise the transgenders, because real women wore makeup, transgendered women wore makeup. It's simple as that. You create one standard and have everyone follow it, and people are going to start thinking that way. Now here we also began to have the allowance for men to have hair a bit longer. This is still not too extreme in terms of historically, because men did have hair this length in some periods in medieval times and beyond, but for decades before this they didn't. They had short hair. So this here, pushing the idea of longer hair and allowing it to be something the public did, it was again changing opinions on what is normal for gender. And notice that this is done a few decades later than they started changing things for females, so it does seem they were moving the MTF agenda forward a little faster than the FTM one, but they've done this. Now, what they did to counteract this was also some men began having more facial hair in this time period as well, whereas the typical man was clean-shaven for decades before then. So, they're careful when they push the agenda forward. They make allowances, so a man with long hair can still have a beard and people will be, oh, he's got a beard, he's male. Not that every man with long hair did have a beard, but, they're tricky. They don't just throw things out at the public and try and make them accept it. They allow you to have a crutch of some kind, like, facial hair for a man with long hair. And here they're still pushing the you can't be skinny thing, but what they mean is that you have to have a voluptuous figure. Now, I know a lot of women who don't have a really pronounced hourglass figure, so when they promote the one look where it's the tiny waist, the big bosom, the wide hips, not every female has that look. And it's not that this person isn't skinny, because she is a slim person, right? The person they're using for this advertisement. She's a slim person, she just has the weight distribution in the way they would call correct. So women looking at this would have been kind of seeking after an ideal that for many of them would have not been possible, because they don't genetically have the ability to have weight distributed in this kind of manner. So all of these advertisements, pounding it into women's heads, you're not okay the way you are, you're too skinny, you're too fat. They've been attacking the female mindset for a long time. Maybe you don't want to be a movie star, but what girl doesn't want to look like one? Well, I guess back then most people didn't want to be a star. These days everyone's obsessed with what others think about them, and, the posting on social media, trying to get attention, trying to get likes and have a following. It's everyone these days wants to be like the stars, so they've pushed that forward as well. They've made their stars even more like something everyone's obsessed with and wants to be like now. Apparently the first one of these was in 1963, was when it was invented. They weren't actually used popularly in that time period as so much as they have been in later years, but there's never a dull moment in the world of figuring out how to alter the female figure to allow it to be something that the transgenders can more closely approximate. Now in this decade also, the 1960s, was when the first mega-sized implants were implanted into a person who I believe was a stripper, which wouldn't be surprising. So like I was talking about earlier, the obsession with the large chest was not around for decades before this. Obviously there would be people who would appreciate it, but not so much that it became the be-all and end-all of attractiveness. And this idea, this meant that so many women would also consider getting implants because they want to look like the popular women who have really large chests and are really thin. Actually, if you look at the yearly statistics for your country, wherever you live, and look how many women per year are getting implants, you might be a little bit shocked. Because if you look at the per year numbers and then look at over the past few years, you'll notice that probably quite a sizable number of your population are implanted. They've managed to make women desecrate their bodies by inserting plastic into them, completely warped a lot of men's perceptions on what's actually appealing. In the 70s, they had a few different looks for males' hair. Some of it was short, and we had the sideburns look. Now this is a bit more like the female look that some women had in the 20s and 30s. So they set up that baseline to create a hairstyle that was short but still female, in the 20s to allow people to think, oh, it's not long, it's not female, but it's still different from male, so we can accept it. But now they've gone and given it to the men. So they're pushing that along as well. They're, again, dissolving the boundaries of what's acceptable for either gender. And then you have the long hair for the males again, often paired with the facial hair, so you can accept it. Hair still had a lot of volume for women, so again, it disguised the large skulls, and now they really started pushing the lose weight agenda. This advertisement is so amusing to me. It's using every trick in the book, proven and tested by thousands, so you trust that other people accept it already, and they're telling you you're foolish to not accept it because it's already been proven. Good for men and women, it's okay for everyone. It's new. Oh, how exciting. Everybody's doing it. Oh, peer pressure. Enjoy it. It's better than those gross foods. Oh, fat people die younger. Oh, yes. Must use fear to make you want to be really thin. And then, of course, proving that it has been proven. So obviously they really pushed this at people. During the 70s, obviously, there was a lot of drug abuse, and a lot of times people who abuse drugs will be very kind of thin and wasted away. So I'm kind of not surprised that during this time period they really began to push the thin look as well. So essentially over these decades, from the 1940s to the 1970s, we had the media and the powers that be, those hidden behind all these agendas, we had them pushing the idea that the female body is never good enough. It's either too skinny or too fat. It's never the right shape. It needs to be changed into a different shape. Through surgery, through body-altering undergarments, they had to change the body in some way. And they did that partly to disguise their transgenders and partly just to make real women feel inadequate and unhappy with themselves. Change the attractions of men. They also worked on changing the ideas of what's normal for either gender, through changing hairstyles, and through mild body modifications such as the use of makeup and hair removal that created an artificial standard for what equals female in most people's perceptions. The moral decline of society over these decades was quite steep and rapid as well. At the end of the 70s, we dissolved into a period of drug abuse and immoral living. So they pushed these agendas simultaneously, the altering of the idea of gender and the unimportance of living a virtuous life. So when we look at people from these decades, we need to remember the kinds of ways that they could have been disguising transgenders with regular people and trying to make regular people look more like transgenders. So that's the 1940s to the 1970s, and that's that.